answer those questions, but here's my reminder to start recording.
Thank you. I just remembered that, and I think I pressed record. Okay. So if you weren't at our first Lunch and Learn series, just really quick about what these webinars are. They started in January, and they're just monthly opportunities to learn about science and education topics. And so the first one, we talked about education, interpretation, outreach, and marketing, and kind of went through how we define it as an agency and how they all work together. Today, of course, we're talking about how people learn. And then you can see the rest of the schedule through June. We will have more in the last 6 months of this year as well. We'll just come up with those topics soon and let everybody know. So if you're interested in attending the rest of these, after this presentation today, I'm definitely going to be sending out some evaluations because I'd love to get your input on how we can make this work for you, what we can do to make this a really good series, and then if there's any other additional topics that you're interested in. And so then when I send that out, I'll also send out how to sign up for the rest of the series. Okay, so what are we doing today? We're learning about how people learn. And so we're going to do that a few different ways. We're going to be having some discussions today. So if you are feeling motivated and excited about this topic, definitely encourage you to participate in some discussion. Feel free to have your video on unless you're having a bad hair day like Sean is. I understand if that happens. But have your video on, be ready to discuss, and be ready to be actively learning and listening about how people learn. So we're going to go over understanding the world around us. We're going to take a look at some perspectives of children and kind of have some discussion about that. We're going to talk about how does learning happen. We're definitely going to get into some theory today, but I don't want to bog you down with too much jargon, so we're going to keep it practical. Thinking about how learning is about connecting, making connections around us from our world to our brain, going into research-based best practices for learning, what we can do in whatever role that we play to facilitate learning, and then putting it into practice. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to hear from the group and hear from you. If you feel like participating, which I would love if you would, I just want to know, how would you define learning? And you can either put it in the chat or you can unmute and share your input. And we'll just discuss for just about 1 minute. How would you define learning? Lizzie, I was hoping people would be awake today. If this was in person, we'd have like coffee and snacks, right?
So there is quite a few in the chat box. We have gain new information, the ability to retain information for future use, getting more information on a topic, absorbing and processing. That's really good, the processing part. Mm-hmm. Acquiring knowledge, experiential.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I like a lot of these answers, and it'll be interesting to see if any of Jamie, I like that one, living. That's true. We're living, we're learning, right? Okay, thank you so much for participating. So before we dive into what that definition is, or learning about learning, we're going to talk about understanding the world around us, and we're going to do that with a quick activity. I was looking on the internet for some fun quotes from students and children on how they explain certain science topics, and to see kind of how that learning takes place and maybe how that might change. So we're going to look at some fun quotes, kids' perspectives on science. So here's the first one. When they broke open molecules, they found they were only stuffed with atoms. But when they broke open atoms, they found them stuffed with explosions. So that's a really interesting take on that. When people run around and around in circles, we say they're crazy. When planets do it, we say they're orbiting. There's a tremendous weight pushing down on the center of the Earth because of so much population stomping around up there these days. You can see some thought process here trying to explain some scientific.
I do like the up there. Does that imply that there's some people down there?
Yeah, exactly. This is a good one. Many dead animals in the past changed to fossils, while others preferred to be oil. So they had some choice in the matter. Most books now say our sun is a star, but it still knows how to change back into a sun in the daytime. It's pretty great. And the last one, there are 26 vitamins in all, but some of the letters are yet to be discovered. Finding them all means living forever. So this is really interesting, and it kind of shows students trying to explain some complex phenomena based off what they know or what they understand. Is there something in the chat box? Okay, that's good. So this is fun. This is the perspective on science, and I thought, since as I was searching for some of these quotes, I thought since Valentine's Day was coming up, I also found some really fantastic quotes about kids explaining love and what that is. And that goes to show that thought process as well. So we'll look at that. Kids' perspective on love. I think you're supposed to get shot with an arrow or something, but the rest of it isn't supposed to be so painful. No one is sure why it happens, but I heard it has something to do with how you smell. That's why perfume and deodorant are so popular. One of you should know how to write a check, because even if you have tons of love, there's still going to be a lot of bills, says Ava. Romantic adults usually are all dressed up. So if they're just wearing jeans, it might mean they used to go out or they just broke up. It's fantastic. And it isn't always how you look. Look at me. I'm handsome like anything, and I haven't got anybody to marry me yet. Brian, age 7. Love is when you tell a guy you like his shirt, then he wears it every day. So fascinating perspectives.
I think this goes to show, though, that if we look at how these statements, they are indicating that children base their knowledge on what they already know. So they are making the connections to what they have seen or learned or thought before.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, so exactly, Lindsay, that's a good segue. Seeing some of these perspectives on both science and love, I want to hear from you, understanding, maybe what we know about how learning takes place. How do you think the children came up with these ideas? And Lindsay, you had a good segue into that. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? Did someone teach them these things, or how do they put these ideas together? Michelle says their observations.
Yep.
Oh, go ahead. Past experiences, they watch and learn from adults in their lives, or using child perspective and reason. And so they're looking at their experiences so far. Exactly, that's exactly right.
I will say that I have taught my son that love is when you wear the same shirt over and over again after somebody compliments it. So
you specifically instructed.
Right. So some of it is taught directly.
Instruction, right.
Yes,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But you can see a lot of it, especially those science ones, they're thinking about, they know that they see that sun during the day, but they also know stars are at night. And so it's something that we're going to talk about today. Even though a lot of those perspectives seem wrong, what they are is actually alternative conceptions. And so it's a way that students and children are trying to frame and understand and construct an understanding of their world based off little pieces of information that they're putting together. So it's kind of interesting to look at that. So how does learning happen? There's two kind of main overarching views, or there were two main overarching views on learning. The first one is the blank slate view. And that is when, and this is kind of more of that old school type thought process of learning. So that theory kind of posits that learning is a process of being filled with information. Teaching is a transmission of knowledge from instructor to student. So I think of this as a bucket. And you as a teacher or an educator, the student's mind is just an empty bucket, and you're just pouring in information. And if you tell them that information, then they'll learn it. And so that's kind of the blank slate view. And then the other view is the clever minds view. And that is learning is a process of a learner's, they're connecting with what they already know, they're changing their ideas and their explanations. And in this theory, the teacher or the educator or the instructor, they're there to guide learners to build their own understanding. And so with that, I'm going to do a quick poll. So I'm going to give you a quote, and you guys can choose which theory do you think that quote represents? Can everyone see that? There we go. About 10 more seconds. Okay, so most of you chose the blank slate theory, and I would say that was accurate. Again, that blank slate theory is, assuming that those students, they might not know anything about that subject at all, and you are there to just give them the information, and that's how they will learn it. And everyone can see the results. And then here is the second poll. So this quote is, "My role is to understand a learner's conceptions about this topic and help them guide them to a clearer understanding." You feel like that would be blank slate theory or clever minds theory? Fantastic. You guys are learning already. So everybody chose clever minds theory, and that would be accurate. So again, that clever minds theory is just that assumption that, learners already have a lot of well-reasoned, thought out ideas about the world around them or about the topic that you're teaching around them. They're using that prior knowledge to influence, and it kind of filters how they're thinking about the subject. And so as a teacher or instructor, understanding that prior knowledge is going to help you make clearer connections for them. This is a good quote by John Muir, kind of related to this subject. He says, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. The idea of everything being connected is common to many cultures, and it's supported by science. From an environmental educator's perspective, it could be said that learning is about discovering and making these connections." And so I said we wouldn't get too much into the theory in this webinar because I don't want to bog you down with jargon. But here's one slide that really does talk about this theory, because Clever Minds is what's best supported by research and science right now of how we learn. It is supported by so many different fields of science. It's by cognitive psychology, child development, learning and transfer, social psychology, and even neuroscience. And so it's actually called Constructivism learning theory. And that is, some of the definitions of that is, human knowledge is acquired through a process of active construction. And so we are actively constructing that knowledge. It's not just a mere fact that's put into our brains. The concepts are invented rather than discovered, and a learner's prior knowledge and experiences are important to this. We each create our own rules and our mental models, which we use to make sense of our experiences. Learning, therefore, is perceived as an active process of engaging and manipulating objects, experiences, and conversations, and it's examining claims and evidence that support them. Has anyone heard of this theory before? Lindsay, I'm glad that you've heard. So what does the research say?
Oh, go ahead. I just want to point out real quick that just as you're thinking about these, I know Amber is going to go into more of that clever minds or experiential learning or constructivist learning, which really is 3 different ways of saying the same thing of experience leads to knowledge. But it's really not only children having the experience, but it's also adults having those experiences. This is not just true of children's way of learning. Truth be told, adults learn best in this way because they build on their experiences and tie it back to that John Muir quote about we see things in nature that are tied to each other. That's really how the brain works as well. So when I experience something new or I gain a new piece of information, data, if you will, my brain instantly is trying to figure out where to sort it and how to connect it to everything. So, so we really, as an agency, as far as our education goes, the clever minds or that experiential learning is what we are striving for, because it's really making connections in their mind, but also connections to nature and connections to the natural world.
Absolutely. Very good. And that's a good point, Lindsay. Some of this verbiage is talking about students and children, but it is true of all learners that this is how people learn even as adults. So what's the research say specifically about, this theory, and also how we're learning, how we're getting that information? Of course, it's all about the learner's prior knowledge, where all learners bring to learning their own, often complex, worked out ideas. And so as instructors, or as people are communicating that, it's our job to kind of figure that out and then help guide in a way that's maybe more accurate or correct. It's an active process. Learning it's actively, we're engaging, mentally manipulating experiences, objects, conversations. It's important. This one does not seem very intuitive, but it's really important to create an environment where maybe students or the group or whatnot will struggle with ideas. And what that means is they need to have opportunities to question their own assumptions and then apply those new understandings in different contexts. The learner's framework. So we as learners, we construct our understanding of our world based on our experiences. You saw some of those quotes, especially the ones of love from those students. They're really subjective, but each one of them probably has a story behind how they came up with some of those ideas about love. So on our own experiences, our motivations, even our cultural and social interactions with peers influences our framework. And that's really important process of this. Alternative conceptions is a really, really important part of learning. Like I said, it has a negative connotation. You might have a class or a group and you might point to a track that you're looking at or something. And a student will say, oh, I know that that's an elephant track. Instead of just shutting that down right away, there's an opportunity to say, well, what makes you think about that? And draw on, maybe the process of how they came to that, and then help use that same process of observation to maybe guide them to what that might be. And so just remembering it's not necessarily a misconception or something inaccurate. It's more alternative conceptions. As soon as we're born, we are learning as Homo sapiens, as humans, we're learning to seek patterns, look for patterns, make generalizations to explain the world around us. That's where we're actively learning. And so some of those conceptions might be more accurate than others. And then building connections, like what Lindsay said, this is extremely important. This is fascinating to me. Learning is creating new connections between ideas, experiences, and even physical connections in our brain. So every time we learn something, we are creating new neural pathways in our brains. And then when we have more experiences with it, especially sensory experiences, like what Lindsay mentioned, experiential experiences, getting outside and going on a bird walk or seeing a butterfly on a flower versus in a textbook, that's going to create this really strong neural pathway and enhance those connections in the future. So putting that all together.
Can I make a quick comment here? If you go back a slide, I think it's really important, the struggle with ideas and the learner's framework. And the reason I say that is because I do not often go into the political world, but if you get into an argument that's with someone that has a different political view than you, if you say, no, you're wrong, here's the accurate way, you are not likely to change their mind. And when students, regardless of their age, come into us as learners, if they come with these preconceived ideas and those prior knowledge, that learner's prior knowledge, it may be wrong. And oftentimes we find it is wrong. But if we just simply say to them, no, you're wrong, and here's the accurate information, they are not likely statistically
No, the video's not on.
Contain that information.
It's not on.
Michelle, you should probably mute yourself, just FYI.
Sorry.
That's okay. So we really want them to experience and come to their own understanding and draw their own conclusions. And we guide them as educators, we guide them to that. But our job is not to, as I like to say, puke our knowledge on them, because really it's just going to make them dirty and not want them to learn more.
Also, if you said, no, you're wrong, the opportunity for learning ceases to exist then, and then it's just done.
It's done. And if I'm a learner and somebody says, no, you're wrong, especially in front of a whole group of people, I've lost that learner. They are no longer going to trust me because I've violated that relationship with that I've had. I've embarrassed them basically. And so if you say, oh, that's an interesting idea, let's explore that more. Or honestly, sometimes I used to say, oh, that's interesting. I used to think the same thing, which I didn't necessarily, but it comforted them and opened the door for them to learn more things.
Exactly. It's very good. So kind of putting that all together, this is what the learning cycle in this conceptual framework will look like. And this is something really helpful to think about if you're putting on programs, or if you're putting on a webinar, or even if you're communicating to the public on some complex topics. So the first thing is invitation. This is so important, and this a lot of times has to do with the environment or the setting where the learning takes place. And so that setting should be welcoming, welcoming to learn. It's emphasizing the process of learning, and not necessarily if it's a right or wrong answer, but you're emphasizing and encouraging the process of, critically thinking about things. Exploration is the next step. So making sure they have opportunity to access their prior knowledge, because we know that that prior knowledge that they bring to the table is incredibly important for them to then learn new concepts and build on that. And so we want them to explore, we want them to make observations and discover information that maybe challenge their own ideas. Concept invention, that's when they start to construct those new frameworks. We all have like this conceptual framework and mental map in our brain when it comes to certain subjects. If I say bird right now, many of you might have, maybe 2, 3, 4, or 5 different words in your mind, or maybe images in your mind, and none of them are going to be the same as everybody else. And so we all have our own conceptual frameworks on subjects, and our role as educators, as teachers, is to help build on that. Application. So that is when they're going to have the opportunity to then apply new frameworks into different contexts. And so maybe they're thinking about food chains, and they're really familiar with, what they do. Like their family has to go to the grocery store and they cook dinner, but then you take that and you apply it to what would a fox do? Does a fox have to go to the grocery store? And how does that work in an ecosystem, in a forest? And so you're taking their previous conceptual frameworks and then applying it into new settings, and that's how learning really takes place. And then reflection is really critically important as well. That's going to be opportunities for them to reflect on how their new information might kind of add to their existing information, and discussion and discourse is really helpful for this. Okay, so we learned that learning is mostly about making connections from our world, all the way from our world to our brain, thinking about ideas, thinking about different experiences. If you want to practice this, if you want to see this actually happen, if anyone knows any young children in your life, if you're excited, if you're lucky enough to have some young little ones in your life, ask them, some really cool science questions like, where do you think the stars come from? Or how do you think it rains, and things like that, and see what they come up with, because it's fascinating. And that in itself, I feel like, shows you instantly that it's definitely not that blank slate theory. It's definitely the clever minds, because they're putting things together. So with that, I actually asked my little guy this morning if he'd like to help me with work. And I asked him if he could help me teach. I said, I'm teaching my friends today how people learn, and I asked if he could help me explain some things to them. And he was very, very excited to help me. And so here's a quick video clip. And I asked him 2 important science questions. I asked him where clouds came from, and where snow comes from. So this is his answer. Can everyone hear this?
You are? That is amazing. So if you're a scientist, can you help me answer a question? Where do clouds come from? What do you think?
They come from choo-choo trains
Choo-choo trains.
and puff up.
Like the puffs in the choo-choo trains? That's where we get clouds?
Yeah, there's smoke and then they turn into white clouds.
Oh man, that makes sense. How do you know this? Or how did you figure this out?
Out by myself.
Oh, you did?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking in your
Lindsay, can you hear this okay or no? Oh, you're on mute,
brain?
sorry.
It's really quiet, I will say.
Okay, maybe I'll try to reshare.
When you share, reshare, and then add video.
Okay. And then can you see this now?
Yes.
Okay, so what's your name?
Can you hear that?
And are you a scientist?
It's a little better.
You are? That is amazing. So, if you're a scientist, can you help me answer a question? Where do clouds come from? What do you think?
They come from choo-choo trains
Choo-choo trains.
that puff up.
I asked him where clouds come from, and he said from choo-choo
That's where we
trains
get
that puff up.
Yeah, and there's smoke and then they turn into white clouds.
Oh man, that makes sense. How do you know this? Or how did you figure this out?
Out by myself.
Oh, you did?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking in your brain?
At my science office.
In your science office. What about all this snow? Where does snow come from? What do you think?
It comes from the mountains and then it floats over.
And if you can't hear, I asked him where snow comes from, and he said it comes from the mountains and then it floats over here
So snow comes
to
from the mountains.
Nebraska, and that's how we get snow.
Oh, why do you think snow is so cold? What makes it so cold?
And so,
How come it's not warm?
Because I
can you see that okay, Lindsay?
Yes.
Okay. So with that little clip, you can see that, you know, he is putting these things together based off what is familiar to him. So he loves trains, he loves choo-choo trains, and he sees clouds, and he sees that they're white puffy smoke. They look like white puffy smoke. So his idea about where clouds come from is they come from choo-choo trains, and that's how we get clouds. So that is just kind of showing you that conceptual framework that even as as young as little kids, they're constantly putting together that understanding of our world around us, which is really important to keep in mind when we're teaching. Okay, so what do we do with all this information? How does this help us create the best learning environments for people, whether, like I said, we're doing programs or we're communicating to people, or even, you know, in our everyday conversations, even like around our family. You know, this is helpful in everyday communications as well. So here are some basic best practices to kind of take away from this. One of the things is avoid show and tell. And this one doesn't seem as intuitive, you know. You think show and tell is really exciting. But what you have to remember is real world investigations and observations and explorations, you know, getting them to actually discover things for themselves and not just holding things up and talking about them. That's going to be really, really helpful for the learner. Use that learning cycle. Consider, you know, that learning cycle of the invitation, exploration, the reflection. Allow learners to explore, to become curious, and make connections. Less telling and memorizing, and more put emphasis on, you know, critical discussions and the process. Give them opportunities to think and to reason and to reflect and to apply their new ideas to new situations. Avoiding canned spiels. And so that's something that really is a kind of almost a low-hanging fruit that we can work on. Instead, ask probing questions. What does this remind you of? Remember to tap into the group or the student's prior knowledge, and then use that to inform your instruction and to be flexible. Broad questions and listening. Cultivate learning environment that celebrates good thinking and evidence-based explanations. And discussion-based. Provide ways for learners to represent their ideas. So when we're having discussions, if we're having a discussion right now, I have to access what I already knew about something, and I have to kind of synthesize what I just learned and then present it out loud to my peers or to a group, and that in itself is a learning process. That's really, really helpful. Are there any questions about this before I move on? Oh, what is an example of a canned spiel? Okay, we're gonna actually talk about that right now. Thanks, Jamie. Okay. So putting this into practice, there's just a few slides left of this. So which scenario do you believe would allow for greater learning and connections to take place? And so there's going to be two scenarios, and it's going to be, let's say we're taking a group of students, let's say we're at a state park and we're taking them to a pollinator garden, and we're talking about pollinators and pollination today. So which scenario do you feel would be best? The first scenario, we're out there in the garden and we see a butterfly, and we have everybody gather around, and this is what we say. This is a pollinator. You can tell because it has a long proboscis or a tongue, and it's using it to drink the nectar from the flower. You can see there's pollen on it if you look closely. Butterflies are really important pollinators. And that's your kind of canned spiel, Jamie. So that first scenario versus the second scenario. You have the same group of kids out there, you see the same butterfly, but then instead you are starting to ask them questions. What do you notice about this insect? What do you see it doing? Why do you think it's doing that? What does it remind you of? And that's when maybe towards the end you can say, we know that pollinators drink nectar from flowers. We know that a lot of times they gather the pollen, and we observe the insect doing these things. Do you think this could be a pollinator? And kind of guiding them to that conclusion. So how do we feel? Do we feel like the first or the second scenario would be a better learning environment? You can raise your hand for the first one, or you can put it in the chat. There you go.
We see a lot of people saying the second one.
Yeah. Very good. So using those guiding, probing questions to help them guide to their own understanding of it, versus the first one, it was just giving them the information. All right, and for the last kind of activity, we're going to apply this to, let's say, for example, if we're going to go on a hatchery tour, which is something really cool that we could do in our state. And so we're thinking about the learning cycle. We're thinking about the best ways that learning takes place and engaging the group, whether it's a group of students or a group of like families, it's the same practices can apply. And so the first thing that we'd want to do is welcome the group. We set those expectations for what they might see, what they might experience, and what they might learn. And the reasoning for this, based off what we've learned about learning, is we're inviting them to learn. We're providing that learning structure. We're setting up that context for them to learn. And the next thing is we could relate concepts to what they know. Maybe engage the group and ask them those probing questions. Who likes to fish? Have you ever eaten fish? Where have you seen fish before? And we're tapping onto that prior knowledge and that conceptual framework that they have already, so that we can use that to then expand and help them expand their understanding. The next thing, we don't want to tell them what we're doing. We don't want to just stand there and just say, this is what we do at a fish hatchery, but instead show them. Better yet, if we could get them to participate in any part of the process, get their hands on some type of the process. We're creating novel hands-on sensory experiences. The learner is actively engaged, and then creating those connections. And those connections and those neural pathways, like we mentioned, are going to be even stronger when they're actually participating in a process. Engage with a group by asking probing questions. What do you notice? Why do you think we do that? As we're moving through the tour, as we're moving through explaining what happens at a hatchery. And that's going to facilitate the learning. Rather than just transmitting information, it's going to help them build on their existing ideas. Pose real-world challenges to the group and allow for discussion. So maybe once the tour is mostly over and we learned about, we have trout here and we have to keep the temperature at a certain like cold temperature in order for them to survive. Maybe after that you ask them, what would happen if in our streams, if the temperatures in our streams in Nebraska were to increase? What would be the implications of that for our native fish? And get them to actually think about that and discuss, because then they're learning these concepts during this activity, And then they're applying it to different concepts, and they're discussing using discourse, using real world examples, and that's really going to help cement that learning and that experience. And then concluding with key takeaways and relating it to the big picture of how it relates to their world, and always ask for questions. So reflect on what you learned, tie it back to the why, not just the what of what we did at the tour, but why. Why is it important to have fish hatcheries in our state? How does it relate to them? And connecting it back to their world. Does anyone else have any ideas of, in that example of a hatchery tour, maybe activities or things that we could do to best facilitate a learning environment? Is there anyone from fisheries here? Touch tank, okay, exactly, very good, yeah. If there's an opportunity for them to touch a fish, that would be incredible. Getting their hands dirty, absolutely, very good. Okay. Oh, having a microscope to see the scale or the skin, yeah, taking a closer look. You know, allowing them, a microscope allows them to explore a totally different world. So that's exciting. That's very good. Feed them something and see what they might eat. Yep, asking them questions. These are really great examples.
A quick thank you to Fisheries for helping Amber work through that. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Something that shows what they eat. Very good. Okay, and so my last slide is just a kind of a reflection. I want you to think about, have your ideas changed about how we learn? Have they changed at all? And how might you use this? How might you use how we've learned, you know, how people learn and how to best facilitate learning environments in your everyday role, whether it's in your professional job or in your personal life as well. Especially given if you remember kind of what you said at the beginning of the presentation of how you would define learning. You know, maybe reflect on that. Has that definition in your mind changed a little bit? And if you feel like it has, you can feel free to add into the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and let us know. Other than that, if there's any questions, you can let me know. And let's see.
I think, Amber,
Yes.
sometimes it makes me think about the variables that make it difficult to teach this way. And the first one I think of is like time constraints, and how to fit that kind of, because that is, it seems like it's a slower, more observant, you know, kind of almost like an emotional connection happening as well.
Yeah.
And that takes time. So that's all I was thinking about.
No, that's a really good point. Was that Jamie?
It was Angie, I believe. Yes.
Oh, Angie?
No, it was Jamie Bachman.
Okay. Okay. Jamie, that's a really good point. And I think time, of course, is a really important variable. I think it's important to remember the objective of what you're trying to accomplish. Of course, we want to get across concepts and concrete ideas. However, if you're emphasizing the process of getting them to critically think about phenomena and discussing and maybe practicing, you know, our scientific skills of observation and discussion, and comparing and contrasting different evidence, you know, next to each other. If that takes place, even in a short amount of time, then I think that's still a successful program, even in a small setting. Lindsay, do you have anything to comment on that?
I do. You know, I think back to, and this is one example, but if we look at Nebraska State Science Standards, they used to cover, God bless it, just a ton of knowledge, but at really shallow levels, right? So for example, students were learning that butterflies have a 4-stage life cycle. And that was it. And that's where it ended. But that knowledge, what I call Jeopardy knowledge, is really not useful. What is, however, useful is learning that butterflies have a 4-stage life cycle, and really 1/2 of their life cycle, their larval stage, requires some habitat requirements, and the adult requires different habitat requirements. And so how those play into each other and what implications that has for the habitat and for our interactions with butterflies is what's important. So when we updated state science standards, we really truthfully made the conscious decision to remove vast amounts of content to be able to go deeper into those limited number of concepts. And what we are seeing is that students are learning the process of deductive reasoning, they're learning critical thinking skills, they're learning compare and contrast skills, and those will lead them farther in life because it is those skills that they can apply to, for example, buying a home, comparing and contrasting, looking at all the variables, drawing it together. Or if they happen to go into a science field, they're going to need those skills. If you need to know that butterflies have 4-stage life cycles, you can Google that. And our learning, the way we learn and the way we receive information has changed so drastically in the past 20 to 30 years with the increase of technology and the internet, that rote memorization or rote content is no longer so critical to have, but it's those skill sets that are important to have. So even if you have a limited amount of time, which we often do with our visitors, if we can spend the time working on those critical thinking skills and those processing skills, we're going to be better off than when they find something in nature and we aren't around. They can Google that. They can Google, what is this snake that I found in Northeast Nebraska that is red and black? And the answer is nothing. So you should probably reassess where you are or what colors it is. But that is, we can Google that kind of stuff. We want them to be thinking of the processes and making those connections, both mental connections and emotional connections.
Hi, this is Carolyn, and I think it's really interesting that you talked about the power of observation, because I have had a number of foster daughters, and a lot of them they're teens. Actually, they've almost all been teens. And one thing I've noticed is that there is a lack of their ability to be observant of what's going on around them. And I keep thinking, like, if I can help them be more observant, that is one thing that will help them in the future. And I think that it's important to recognize that, not like, I know what their background where they came from, lots of trauma, and that causes people to think very differently as well. And so it's one of the things that has surprised me a lot is, like, for example, I have a bright blue car. Sometimes I have a box on top, sometimes I don't. One of my kids came out one time and was like, "Did you get a new car?" Because I had taken the box off. My car is bright blue. And that's where it really struck me. Wow, power of observation. And that, these kids really need it. And I think it has been left out of the curriculum at school a fair amount. That thought process and that observing what's out there and around you.
That's really great, Carolyn. Thanks for sharing that. And again, it's almost like shifting our thoughts and our ideas and our mental priorities on what it is to learn. Is it just getting information? Is that useful in this world? Like Lindsay said, any of us, most of us have a smartphone in our pockets. We can look up anything that we want. And so is that useful, or is it really thinking about, creating lifelong learners by investing in helping them think about those skills that helps become lifelong learners, which is observations, or critically thinking, or being able to discuss and think about your ideas, share the evidence and explanations behind them. So that's really good. Jess,
And I was going to say, Jess had a really nice comment of quality over quantity. And I think that it's really important. Oftentimes we talk about making connections and we'll use big pedagogy education words, but really in the end, what education is supposed to be doing is making connections. And that is critical for the future of our work in our natural resources, because if people are not making that not only knowledge connection or that cognitive connection, but also the social emotional connection, then they aren't going to care about this in the future. And so much of what we aim to do in our education efforts and interpretation efforts is to make that connection.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in discussion today. You've had a lot of really great reflections and thoughts and comments and good questions. We hope you learned something today on how people learn. And if you have any follow-up, by the way, I meant to say this is just like the tip of the iceberg. This is a whole field of study. And so there's lots to learn about how we learn. It's actually a fascinating field of study. Like I said, it involves multiple different types of sciences. So if you have any more questions, I am by no means an expert in this, but I do have some really cool resources that I can send you if you want to learn more about something. Other than that, definitely be on the lookout for an email from me. I'd love to get your input and to see, what else we could do to make this series better, and to see if there's any other topics that you'd be interested in learning about. So thank you so much, everybody. And Lindsay, thank you so much for co-hosting. It was fantastic. And I like your commentary. I like the concept of asking learners for help. Oh, we're still getting some really good comments.
Yeah.
Teresa says,
Yeah.
asking learners for help, it struck me that by asking her son to help her, it was likely a little ego boost as well. Yeah, absolutely, for sure. You're getting on the level playing field. You're saying that your thoughts on ideas on this is just as valid. Are they 100% accurate? No. But again, we're putting the emphasis on the process of thinking through and learning things. And so, yeah, that's very good. Lindsay, what were you saying?
I was going to say, this is often a strategy that teachers will use, or I have used in the field. If I see a student that is maybe struggling, come on up and help me, be my leader. And what I find is that then that student becomes more engaged in what we are learning and really starts to have those experiences. And so oftentimes I will say that our behavior issues that we see in a formal K-12 classroom are because students aren't engaged. And we are very fortunate because we teach in an environment that we can easily and do, and if done properly, are actively, constantly engaging students in a very meaningful, hands-on way. And that oftentimes means that not only are we boosting their ego, but we're also making better connections, and truth be told, we see fewer behavior issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
I think that's everybody. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody. And have
a great afternoon.
Yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.